Hello, my name is Jennifer Long. I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma and the director of our interdisciplinary core curriculum. I'm here today speaking with the Giles Symposium keynote speaker, Dr. James Galbraith, and we are going to be talking a little bit about some of the themes in his latest work, which he will be talking to us about later this evening. So if I can just ask you a few questions about your latest work, The End of Normal. I'm going to start just by asking if you could give us a description of what you mean by normal.
Oh, well, that's relatively straightforward,
Yes.
although it may not be what everybody else thinks of it. The argument I make is that certainly economists had a developed expectation of what the performance level of the economy would be at any given time, and that was based upon the experience of the post-war period. And one of the key developments of the last 6 years is that we haven't measured up to that standard. And that then raises the question as to why not.
Yes.
The argument of the book is that, well, it's become much more difficult to meet that standard. And so the previous notion of what was driving normal performance may no longer apply.
Yes. In this work, you are quite critical of the economics profession, and is part of
that's a habit of mine.
Yes, it is, and it should be. Is part of that end of normal because the economics profession has misdefined normal, or?
Yes. I mean, the practice of drawing a line through past experience and just projecting a trend into the future is one bit of malpractice.
Yes.
The practice of saying, well, there's something called the labor market, which will give us over time an adjustment back to some standard rate of unemployment, is another piece of malpractice. These are kind of mental shortcuts that have become embedded in the way many economists work, and yeah, that's a problem.
All right. The end of normal. What has changed within the current decades or the past few decades that will prevent us from returning to that normal, whether it's been misdefined or not?
Yeah, well, I think there are many things, but I focus on 4 of them in the book. One of them is both the cost and the uncertainty of the resource future. The cost was certainly a factor behind the slump in 2007, 2008, and oil prices went up to $148 a barrel. Great for producers, but really bad for if you happen to be a consumer. The future obviously has been affected by natural gas, but there are lots of things about the long-term future of that we don't know. So that situation is much more uncertain than it was before. Globally, the strategic and security environment is deteriorating and unstable. And one thing we learned from, and in particular our professional military learned from the disasters in Iraq and the problems in Afghanistan, is that there are real limits to what they can do. I mean, not just limits on what they can do, but limits on what military power can achieve in the world. The third thing is that we really are in a world where technological change is affecting how businesses employ workers, and particularly for-profit businesses looking at improved economic conditions are always looking these days for ways to substitute information processing machinery, solid state equipment for people. And then fourthly, the economy has been run for 3 or 4 decades now on the impetus of the financial sector, deciding that this sector, information, or that sector, real estate finance, are going to be the driving forces. I think there's a good case that it's not going to perform that function in the future.
I'd like to go back to the technology part
Sure.
of that explanation. In the standard neoclassical econ model, we tend to place great faith in technology as being the propeller of growth and the creator of
Right.
jobs. You make the case that technological change now is different than that before.
I think there's still an important benefit to living standards to have the digital revolution.
Gadgets.
It's obviously lots of things that were not previously available to us, very readily available. But if you compare this wave of technological change to the big ones in the last century. There are very important differences. When we moved from horses to automobiles, well, we had to build roads. We needed not only factories to produce the automobiles, but vast networks of shops to maintain them. We needed a fueling system, so we needed the energy industry. And at the end of the day, the horses lost out, but there were a lot of workers who were employed and who came off the farm and ended up in an economy that was strongly influenced by the automobile. Well, when you're looking at solid-state devices, smartphones and iPads and so forth, you're looking at equipment that is, first of all, manufactured largely offshore. It does not really get repaired. It doesn't have the infrastructure, which is fiber optic cables and so forth, doesn't wear out the way roads do, so there isn't that big. And so in many different ways, the labor requirements of this are much less. And I think that makes a big difference. It's not as though this is, it's not as though the elements of technological change, which you mentioned, the neoclassical model, are absent, but the balance between things is really quite different from what it was before.
More destructive than creative.
There was a creative phase, but now there's a vast destructive phase, and that's ongoing. Yeah.
So, if it appears that perhaps our standard model definition of economic growth is not as germane to our present situation, if you could redefine growth for both economists and the general public, what are we looking towards for the future?
Well, in terms of what growth should be, I would say we should be looking for stable and sustainable ways to maintain and improve living standards, and to do so very inclusively to protect the population. So if you have, I mean, here's the drama of continuing to rely on a purely growth-driven policy. One is that you may not be able to achieve it, and the other is that let's rephrase that. You may not be able, you won't be able to achieve it. You may not be able to achieve it, and since you won't be able to achieve it, a great many more people will end up in a position of absolute loss. If you had high growth, then of course most people are getting better off.
Some much better, some
less. But yeah, and if it's low, then you have more people who are actually experiencing deterioration, and so you need to be more focused on preventing that and protecting the broader population. Right. And the instinct is actually the other way.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So the 2008 crisis is probably most widely identified with a failure of the banking system.
Yes.
And in The End of Normal, you talk extensively about the failure of regulation. What needs to be done in the financial and banking industry to prevent a similar crisis? Is it well suited to take us forward?
Well, it's certainly not well suited to take us forward. The difficulty of dealing with these institutions now is that the big opportunities were missed when they were there in 2009. What we should have done at that point was to restructure the industry, reduce it in size, take it back to where it was 30 or 40 years ago. We had banks then, but they were not the single dominant force in the economy. We had more of them. Individual leaders were less powerful. They had less of a death grip on the government, and the central bank, and so forth. So that would have been useful. We've lost the moment when we had the leverage to do that. Going forward, I think the outlook is pretty grim. It would help if you had a stronger, autonomous, forceful regulatory apparatus, people who were monitoring the behavior of the bankers. But when you're talking about a half a dozen major institutions, first of all, the institutions are so big and cumbersome that the people running them don't even know where their risks are. And secondly, they have such a reach in the government, not only here but in Europe, that even if you the ideas that I'm offering here don't have any purchase in the political system. So it's a situation about which I am not optimistic.
Yes. It seems to me that a theme throughout your newest work has more to do with politics than economics, and it's difficult to talk about one without the other.
Right.
Here at the university, we teach them together. One is the regulation of the financial industry, and the other is a conversation about the national debt. And our politicians seem to hone in on the debt to the detriment of other economic conversations.
Yes, there's a tremendous tendency to talk about this vast non-issue.
Yes.
And why do I say it's a non-issue? Because I can pick up the newspaper in the morning and look at the interest rate that the U.S. government pays on its debt, and I can look at whether its auctions ever fail or whether they have any trouble so-called financing the U.S. government. And the reality is that we don't, that we're a very large country to which in spite of all of our difficulties, the rest of the world regards as financially pretty good bet.
Yes.
And so we've lucked out on that score. Now, if we were having this conversation in Athens or even in Rome, it would be a different story, but we're not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and we hope that everyone is able to come and hear your keynote tonight, and we are very much looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.